Princess Caroline of Monaco is one of the most recognized royal figures in Europe, yet the real story of her life remains largely untold. Behind the magazine covers and palace ceremonies lies a woman shaped by duty before she could speak, loss before she could grieve properly, and resilience built not from privilege, but from survival. At 68, she carries a lifetime of weight that Monaco has rarely chosen to show the world. Caroline was born on January 23, 1957, inside the Prince's Palace of Monaco, not in a hospital or private clinic, but in the royal apartments themselves. From her very first breath, her existence carried a significance far beyond family joy. Due to the 1918 Franco-Monegasque Treaty, the question of an heir was not merely a family matter, but a political one. If Monaco had no clear successor, France held the right to step in and absorb the tiny principality. So, when Caroline entered the world, legal and state concerns surrounded her crib alongside the doctor's. Before she could even open her eyes, she had been registered as hereditary princess. In an instant, her life was tied to the survival of a nation. The weight of that moment only intensified because of Monaco's remarkable smallness. In 1957, the principality covered barely 2 square kilometers and held around 18,000 people. In a place that tiny one child could alter the fate of an entire country. Newspapers across Europe did not report her birth as a normal royal announcement. They treated it as a constitutional event, with some papers printing legal commentary alongside the news, explaining precisely what her arrival meant for Monaco's continued independence. The palace issued an official bulletin recording the exact time of her birth, around 4:15 in the afternoon, so that the order of succession could be formally noted without delay. Caroline became a public figure before she had ever had the chance to be a private person. Yet, even that defining title came with fragility. From birth, she was heir presumptive rather than heir absolute, meaning she would inherit the throne only if no one with a stronger claim appeared. Under Monaco's succession rules at the time, a younger brother would automatically outrank an older sister. So, while she was being presented to the world as the future of the dynasty, her position remained uncertain. Every tutor, court official, and royal doctor looked at her through that lens. The child meant to hold the line unless a boy arrived and changed everything. Her childhood did not begin with security. It began with quiet waiting. The home she was born into deepened that atmosphere. Her mother, Grace Kelly, had given up one of the most dazzling careers in Hollywood to become Princess of Monaco. Before marrying Prince Rainier III in 1956, Grace had an Oscar, major film roles, and earnings of around $100,000 per picture in the mid-1950s, equivalent to close to $1 million per film today. She walked away from all of it. By the time Caroline was born a year later, Grace had already stopped acting entirely. She smiled for cameras, stood beside her husband at ceremonies, and appeared flawless in public. But people close to her later said that privately she mourned what she had surrendered. Friends recalled that she sometimes watched her old films in the palace cinema, not simply to revisit the past, but to remember who she had once been. Around Caroline, she was no longer Grace Kelly the actress. She was Her Serene Highness, addressed formally, governed by duty, and shaped by appearances. Prince Rainier III brought his own form of pressure into the household. He had taken the throne in 1949 at just 25 years old, and he ran Monaco with the focus of a man building a business empire. He pushed tourism, expanded hotels, strengthened the casino industry, and transformed the principality into a luxury destination for the wealthy. His days were packed with meetings, state matters, and endless planning. Staff later described the palace as a place where work consistently came before warmth. Even inside the royal apartments, life often felt more official than personal. Courtiers later noted that Rainier and Grace frequently ate on different schedules or in separate rooms. The children, meanwhile, dined apart from their parents entirely, governed by palace etiquette that required young royals to eat separately until they were old enough to behave properly at the main table. In Caroline's case, that separation lasted until she was approximately 14 years old. In a palace full of people, she could still feel profoundly alone. Then, before she was old enough to understand what had happened, the one role that had defined her birth disappeared. On March 14th, 1958, her younger brother Albert was born. He was male, and under Monaco's succession rules, that changed everything immediately. The moment he entered the line, he moved ahead of her. Caroline went from national insurance policy to second place before she could say her parents' names. That early loss set the tone for much of what followed. Duty stayed, pressure stayed, but certainty did not. The person she leaned on most during these years was not her mother or father, but her nanny, Maureen Wood. Caroline and her brother Albert became so deeply attached to her that when Maureen went away on vacation, both children cried and pleaded so desperately for her return that Grace had to call her back early. It was a telling detail. In a home filled with titles and formality, the nanny became the one person who felt safe and steady. Caroline later admitted openly that the emotional warmth of her childhood came largely from this one woman rather than from the palace family surrounding her. As she grew older, Caroline's escape came through education. She attended St. Mary's in Ascot, then Sciences Po in Paris, and later the Sorbonne, where she studied philosophy, psychology, and biology. She was bright, disciplined, and academically strong, earning her French baccalaureate with high honors. But beneath the achievement lay another truth. She was spending much of her youth away from home, in formal classrooms and boarding school rooms, rather than inside the warmth of a close family. By the time she completed her studies, she was highly polished and emotionally trained to function. But she did not feel rooted. By the late 1970s, she had also become one of the most photographed young women in Europe. Magazine covers multiplied. Paparazzi followed her across Paris, and fashion houses pursued her image. The girl raised inside duty had become a symbol of glamour. The world was far more interested in where she went at night than in what she studied during the day. She became a regular presence in Parisian nightlife, especially at Regine's, where she could dance until early morning and feel, at least for a few hours, less like a princess and more like a young woman simply trying to breathe. But nothing stayed private, and over time the press flattened her into the image of a party princess, intelligent and educated, yet consistently reduced to nightclub photographs and rumor. Then came Philippe Junot. Caroline was 21 when she married him in 1978. He was 38, a French businessman with a reputation for charm, nightlife, and instability, exactly the kind of man her parents feared. The wedding was staged with all the spectacle Monaco could offer: global attention, glittering guests, and the shine of a modern fairy tale. But behind the ceremony, Grace was reportedly deeply distressed and did not believe the marriage would last. What made things worse was betrayal of the most intimate kind. Junot reportedly brought a photographer friend on the honeymoon, and private images of Caroline soon appeared in tabloids. She had not just entered a bad marriage, she had entered a marriage in which even intimacy could be sold. By October 1980, they were divorced. Caroline was only 23. What followed was a period of compounding grief. Her mother, Grace Kelly, died in a tragic car crash on September 14, 1982, and that loss hung over everything. It was in this bruised and exhausted state that Caroline met Stefano Casiraghi. He was 23, Italian, handsome, and warm in a way that made her feel safe almost immediately. Unlike so many men before him, Stefano seemed entirely uninterested in her title or the glamour that followed her everywhere. He treated her like a woman, not a prize. Friends described it as love at first sight. Caroline herself would later say, simply, "I had my fairy tale. We both knew it." They married on December 29, 1983, in a civil ceremony at the palace, in the Hall of Mirrors beneath Grace Kelly's portrait. The wedding lasted about 15 minutes. Together, they went on to have 3 children: Andrea, born in 1984, Charlotte in 1986, and Pierre in 1987. For the first time in her life, Caroline seemed to bloom. Stefano was a devoted and fully present father, athletic and warm, who had also built a successful name for himself as a powerboat racer, winning 12 of 80 offshore races, and setting a Lake Como speed record of 277 kilometers per hour in 1984. More importantly, he had won over Prince Rainier completely, and friends said he made the palace feel less like an institution and more like a home. But Caroline had always feared the sport, and on October 3, 1990, those fears became reality. Off Monaco's coast, Stefano's boat slammed into heavy waves, flipped violently, and he was trapped. He died at just 30 years old. Caroline was in Paris when it happened. When she returned to Monaco, she was dressed in black, a widow with 3 children aged 6, 4, and 3. The announcement from the palace carried terrible force because everyone remembered Grace Kelly's death only 8 years earlier. Whispers darkened the story further. Friends claimed Stefano had received death threats in the days before the crash, and police investigated possible sabotage. In the end, they ruled it an accident, but the feeling that something about the loss was almost too cruel to bear never fully disappeared. The sea below the palace had taken her husband, just as the mountain road above it had taken her mother. Caroline disappeared from public life for a time, retreating with her children to a quiet village in France, far from cameras and from the water that now felt haunted. Those who saw her said she looked transformed by grief, thinner and quieter. She told her children their father was with Jesus in heaven and that they would look after each other now. It was a simple sentence that carried the whole weight of her new life. Even through that grief, she continued to work. She had already founded Jeune J'écoute in 1981, a crisis hotline for young people struggling with addiction, abuse, and suicidal thoughts. After Grace's death, she became president of the Princess Grace Foundation, launched the Ballet de Monte Carlo in 1985, and expanded Monaco's cultural identity in ways that outlasted her personal sorrow. She also became a UNICEF patron and UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador, using her platform to support girls' education and children affected by war and trafficking. Her third marriage, to Prince Ernst August of Hanover in 1999, began with hope but descended into public humiliation, reports of violent behavior, and painful chaos. By 2009, the relationship had effectively ended, though they remained legally married. Caroline turned further inward, focusing on her children, her causes, and the principality itself. Today, at 68, Princess Caroline of Monaco stands as something harder to dismiss than a tabloid figure or a tragic widow. She is a woman who was handed impossible weight before she could speak, lost the people she loved most before she turned 34, and chose, repeatedly, quietly, and without much fanfare, to keep building something that would outlast the grief. The Ballet de Monte Carlo celebrated its 40th anniversary in 2025. Studio Caroline opened beneath Villa Casamara in 2023. The Mediathek Caroline opened with public access in December 2025. In January 2026, her first husband, Philippe Junot, died peacefully in Madrid at 85, the closing of a very old door on a chapter she had long left behind. What remains is not a fairy tale. It is something more durable than that.